Thank you. It did occur to me when I titled this sermon Small But Mighty that it might sound like a message about how our children shape us with their mighty presence and influence. And as your minister of faith formation, I can tell you that would be a wonderfully rich topic. But that is not the small but mighty I am reflecting on today. Perhaps that will be for another happier Sunday. Today's small but mighty is our own faith tradition of Unitarian Universalism. Despite our relatively small size in the larger religious landscape, the Unitarian Universalist influence on American history and culture has been remarkably significant. Our power comes from the ways we have championed social justice, intellectual freedom, and religious liberalism. It comes from the courage of our ancestors through their words and their deeds and their choices to shape a faith that insists on human dignity and centers love as a force for liberation. Our spiritual ancestors were at the forefront of abolition, women's suffrage, LGBTQ+ rights, public education, and environmental protection. We are a tradition that blends reason and compassion, humanist and Christian roots, and a wide diversity of spiritual understandings into a living, evolving, pluralistic faith. And yes, our UU tradition has even stood up to fascism before. Now, I admit I'm a bit of a history nerd. I mean, really. I love tracing those threads of influence, those small turning points that ripple through time. I love uncovering the names and the stories that have left living legacies of decency and justice and love. These quiet forces, these overlooked acts of people being brave and decent and good. These small but mighty moments, they are at the heart of the story I want to tell you today. Reverend Tandy Rogers is the teacher who taught me to claim our UU ancestors, to tell their stories and to hold them close. I think she knew their acts of courage and conviction would offer wisdom and inspiration and comfort when we find ourselves weary and heartbroken. May their presence not only bring solace today, but light the way for what comes next. In 1846, 4 years after the first Unitarian sermon was preached here in Milwaukee, planting the seed for what would become eventually this congregation, Henry David Thoreau walked from his cabin at Walden Pond into the nearby city of Concord, Massachusetts, where he promptly landed in jail. Thoreau's crime was his refusal to pay his taxes. He had not forgotten them. He was choosing not to financially support a government that sanctioned slavery and provoked a war by invading a neighboring country, Mexico. That small act of resistance in his town grew far beyond Concord when Thoreau wrote about his decision and his experience in an essay called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. In it, he condemns American democracy for being compliant, ruled not by justice but by a tyrannical majority that prospers while using canned rhetoric about freedom and liberty to hide behind. I find those hauntingly familiar today, in a time when far too many Americans seem willing to tolerate cruelty and inhumanity so long as some prosper and can still claim the label patriot. Thoreau wrote, "Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do, I see, at any rate, is that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn." Those are wise words to guide us. Like Timothy Snyder's warning in On Tyranny, do not obey in advance, reminding us that we have the power to slow down the rise of authoritarianism. We do this by resisting the oppression we witness, by naming it, by challenging it, and by refusing. When confusion from the never-ending news cycle and exhaustion and it is the first wave of oppression. It is trying to claim our agency. When we fail to claim our values through our words and our actions, we inadvertently yield to the power to those who seek to diminish our freedoms, and long before their authority is really absolute. Historian Brent Powell notes that Thoreau, he was the first American to define and use civil disobedience as a means of protest. What began as one man's refusal to yield to the majority's injustice became an idea that continues to influence conscience-driven resistance around the world. That conviction that a moral minority must not bend simply because a majority is louder or more powerful. Thoreau and his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson were born and raised Unitarian. Reverend Dana Howard states, modern-day Unitarian Universalism was in many ways started by Thoreau and Emerson as a branch of the tree of the historic Christianity that we are now the end of. Emerson points us toward a unifying force greater than ourselves, and Thoreau shows us that we must practice our theology in the here and the now. The result of Thoreau's influence, Dana says, is UU activism grounded in self-reflection. Small things can grow, and that essay that Thoreau wrote grew in the minds and the hearts of others who were inspired to shape their activism in civil disobedience. Mahatma Gandhi, who fought for the rights of the poorest classes, opposed the discriminatory caste system, worked for Hindu-Muslim unity and India's independence, admitted that, quote, Thoreau's ideas greatly influenced the movement in India. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who created moral guidelines for acting nonviolent in the heart of the civil rights movement, built his ideas upon the work of Gandhi, whose work was built upon Thoreau. In King's autobiography, he says, quote, during my early college days, I read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience for the first time. I became convinced then that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. One person's act of defiance can spark a thread of influence that reaches others across time. Each individual contribution strengthens the next, and together, these acts collectively help bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. And that powerful turn of phrase, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, it's widely associated with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, yet its origins go back to a Unitarian minister with a transcendentalist history, the Reverend Theodore Parker, a contemporary of Thoreau and Emerson. Reverend Theodore Parker was a devoted abolitionist and a leader of the Boston Vigilance Committee, an underground network that helped hundreds of enslaved people escape to freedom. At that time in American history, white Unitarians and Universalists, well, they had inconsistent responses to what we now recognize as the evil of slavery. Divisions in our country grew in 1850 when the Fugitive Slave Act passed, making capturing and returning people who had escaped slavery federal law, requiring all citizens and officials to assist in their persecution while denying them due process. This looks like bounty hunters forcibly seeking out people of color while demanding their neighbors be complicit to their capture without due process. And it is hard to not hear the echoes of this dynamic in the actions we are witnessing today, especially this weekend in Minnesota. Some Unitarian and Universalists stayed on the sidelines, but others became abolitionists. When Anthony Burns escaped from slavery and fled to Boston, he was arrested. Boston's Black community and white abolitionists rushed to the courthouse. An estimated 2,000 anti-slavery protesters mobbed Court Square that night and attempted to free Anthony Burns. And on the eve of Burns' sentencing, a crowd of 5,000 assembled at Boston's Faneuil Hall. And there, Theodore Parker told them, "I am an old man. I have heard hurrahs and cheers for liberty many times. I have not seen a great many deeds done for liberty. I ask you, are we to have deeds as well as words?" Parker's urgency, his words and witness, joined with others who refused to obey the Fugitive Slave Act, helped ignite a broad pushback about an unjust law in Boston and then across the country. Their defiance helped shape our faith into one that bears courage to witness systematic injustice wherever it takes root. One courageous act emboldens the next as each of us learns to trust that persistent inner voice, to honor what is right, to care for one another, and to center humanity with love. Many of us, we found our way here to Unitarian Universalism seeking sanctuary and community in the face of oppression and hardship we knew in our own lives. And within this sanctuary, under this roof, in the rooms of this church, we discover companions who allow us to be vulnerable in our struggles. Here, we share our grief, we lay down our burdens, and we find others who will hold them with us. And the rooms in this church are named for our ancestors. Our theme circles meet in the Brown Room, named for Reverend Olympia Brown. Olympia Brown was one of the first women to graduate from college in the United States. She became the first woman minister in the United States in 1863, and she was ordained in the Universalist Church. Olympia Brown served the Church of the Good Shepherd in Racine, Wisconsin, today lovingly renamed Olympia Brown UU Church. And I know many in this congregation began their faith journey in those walls. If you're in here, go ahead and give a shout out or wave your hands. Who are you? There's a few in the back. Your roots, they're part of this story too. Olympia eventually felt called to step away from parish ministry, not because she was tired, but because the fire for women's suffrage simply outgrew the pulpit, and she became the president of Wisconsin's Women's Suffrage Association, leading for nearly 3 decades, from 1884 to 1912. Imagine the persistence that took. Imagine continuing year after year when change came so slowly you could barely see it. She traveled across the country, speaking in small towns and big cities, urging states to recognize women's right to vote. She was one of 1,000 women who marched on Washington, demanding that President Woodrow Wilson finally listen. And she lived long enough to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. After a lifetime to being told she needed to wait, she witnessed that door open. What a long, twisted, unfinished journey women's rights have been, and that journey continues. Just this week, our own Patricia McFarland carried her small but mighty voice up to the state capitol, standing up for reproductive freedom with the same kind of courage that Olympia carried a century ago. Woohoo! Those stories braid together the past and the present, the ancestor and the neighbor, reminding us that our struggle is never one person's work and that each generation has its moment to rise. Small, brave acts are fueled by mighty, mighty values. The young room, the large room downstairs where our children are now gathered for faith formation, which is also where I can usually be found most Sunday mornings, teaching them about these UU values and history, is named for Whitney Young Jr., a civil rights leader whose impact was profound, even if history doesn't always speak his name loudly enough. Raise your hand if you know who Whitney Young is. Yeah, not known. Whitney Young was one of the most influential yet overlooked leaders of the civil rights era. He was an executive director of the National Urban League. He transformed the organization into a powerhouse of economic justice. He believed that civil rights had to be more than laws on paper. They had to be lived in real access to good jobs, decent housing, and quality education. He saw clearly that dignity required not only freedom from oppression, but also the resources to build a life. And there's part of this story that feels very tender to me. During the civil rights movement, Whitney Young spoke right here at First Church. Imagine that, his voice echoing these very walls. And that visit likely happened because of his friendship with Reverend John Cyrus, who served this congregation from 1955 to 1981. Their connection went all the way back to the Omaha Urban League. John was a member, and Whitney's children attended Sunday school at the First Unitarian Church of Omaha, where Reverend Cyrus was then serving. So in a real relational way, our congregation is woven into Whitney Young's story, and his children once sat in rooms much like our young room today. Whitney's work didn't make headlines, but it moved mountains. He worked directly with business leaders, and US presidents pushed for fair employment practices, job training, federal investment in urban communities. He was called the inside man of the civil rights movement because he stepped into boardrooms and government offices where decisions were made and insisted they make room for justice. His efforts shaped the war on poverty, expanded opportunities for Black Americans, and brought civil rights into the very structures that had long excluded them. And now, generations later, our children learn and play and grow in a room bearing his name. His story is a reminder that justice work happens in many forms, some loud, some quiet, all essential, and that sometimes the greatest stories come to those who insist on bringing love and equity to tables of power. Last week, on the heels of our nonviolent resistant training for people of faith, Reverend Jennifer also spoke about other Unitarian Universalists engaged in the civil rights movement. She lifted up Viola Louisa, a Unitarian Universalist housewife from Michigan who was murdered in Alabama for answering the call to Selma. Her death ignited another wave of righteous resistance, just as many other UUs and people of faith who journeyed to Selma returned home and inspired their own communities to join that struggle. Can you see yourself in these stories? I can. I see you showing up, feeding the hungry, tutoring young people, protesting, giving what you can when you can, heartbroken and heartstrong, doing the daily work of becoming good ancestors. I want to be clear, even though history tends to often remember just the individuals, nothing is ever accomplished alone. Every movement is a tapestry of people who share ideas and values, who plant seeds for a future that they cannot fully see but deeply hope for. We are part of that same lineage. This is our time now, our moment to do what we can, individually and collectively. Not all of us can march. Not all of us can give money. Not all of us can speak to crowds or write letters or organize an action. But all of us can do something, and together we can do it all. As we go, we teach our children and those walking beside us how to continue shaping the beloved community we dream of. One act of courage, one act of compassion, one act of solidarity at a time. The Unitarian Universalist legacy is long. It turns out too long for one sermon, though it does hurt my nerdy history heart to leave out so many good ancestors. But before we extinguish our chalice, I need to tell you how the chalice was created to fight fascism. The Unitarian Service Committee was born in 1940, in a moment when the world was cracking open. The power of Nazi Germany was spreading fast, and thousands of people were desperately trying to get out and escape the grip of occupation. Into that urgency stepped Reverend Charles Joy, who was the first commissioner of the Unitarian Service Committee. From his office in Lisbon, the last open port in Europe, Reverend Joy saw a fragile and secret network of couriers and brave local allies, and together they worked to secure travel documents, self-passage papers, and visas, which could mean the difference between life and death. The Unitarian Service Committee, though, well, it was new, and it was unknown, and it was untested, and that made their work hard. It put them at a disadvantage because establishing trust had to be done over the barriers of language and nationality, and that could be the difference between life and death. Reverend Joy knew that that trust was not a small thing. It could be everything. He wrote, "When a document may keep a man out of jail, give him standing with governments and police, it is important that it look important." So he turned to Hans Deutsch. Hans Deutsch was an Austrian artist and himself was a refugee who had fled from the Nazis. And he asked him to create a symbol to be used on official documents. Deutsch did. He created a simple, powerful image, a chalice with a bright flame. And the flaming chalice began as a drawing, just a drawing, but a drawing to fight fascism. A beacon created by a refugee for refugees. And today, we still light it. We light it when we gather together to mark our time and to hold the values that we still hold dear. Now, this weekend, our beloved Reverend Jennifer answered the clergy call to travel to Minnesota, to learn, to prepare, to witness, to stand in solidarity as a part of a day of truth and freedom. And I followed the protests closely all day. And she reached out to let me know she was safe. She was surrounded by over 200 UU clergy and many other faith leaders and 50,000 marchers moving as one body and one voice, determined. And I know many of you are also protesting in solidarity here in Milwaukee, standing in the cold, holding signs, singing, chanting, showing up with your whole hearts. One of the signs that caught my attention simply said, "When cruelty becomes normal, compassion looks radical." And then yesterday morning, we learned that Alex Jeffrey Petty, an ICU nurse, a young man who graduated from high school in Green Bay, was killed by ICE agents. And our hearts broke open again. There is no justification for this. There are no words to make it right. There are only tears. And then after the tears, action. Many of us will gather at the ICE headquarters again this coming Wednesday. And the words on that sign keep echoing. When cruelty becomes normal, compassion looks radical. Friends, we have a responsibility, rooted in faith, rooted in love, to center the margins of society, to give voice to the suffering that too many people are forced to in every system, who decides who is worthy and who is disposable. Each moment in history asks us to live into our values in ways we might have never imagined and do not always welcome. But history keeps asking anyway, because the shape of human history is always held in human hands, in our hands. There are a million small steps towards creating beloved community. What steps will you take? You don't have to know the whole path. You only need to take the next faithful step. And as you do, may you draw near an ancestor, someone whose small but mighty courage made a difference. Bring them close. Let them sit beside you when you feel powerless or numb or furious. Let yourself lament. Let yourself feel righteous anger. It is a sign that your heart is still awake. Find a way to express it that honors your spirit and the life within you. And then, the best you can, center love, especially for those who do not yet understand, whose fear is still louder than their hope. Trust your spirit. Trust your longing for justice. Trust that you are part of a long and living story of people choosing compassion in a cruel time. Because compassion may look radical now, but it has always been the flame that saves us. May we be brave and kind and find a way forward, united in love. Blessed be.